Good morning. I'm Judith Snow, and I'm recording a videotape, or I did record a videotape in the month of May for the Theology and Disability Conference. I hope you're having a great time in Texas, and I'm kind of sorry that I'm not there with you, but I just didn't feel up to the travel this year. So last year, when the conference was in Toronto, where I live, I spoke about how maybe God is quadriplegic and we are the personal assistants for God. And I will get around to that idea again because for me it's very powerful. But I wanted to start somewhere else. I actually almost turned down the opportunity to make this talk for the conference because, generally speaking, I don't like the idea of disability, and I don't spend much time talking about it, or at least I think I don't spend much time talking about it. And so I've obviously agreed to do this. So where I want to start with it is, why do I think that idea is problematic? And in fact, I think the idea is particularly problematic in a faith context. Now, I've been a person with almost no use of my body since I was born. I was identified as having spinal muscular atrophy, which is one of the muscular dystrophies, when I was 7 months of age. But quite likely I was born with it. So I have never known the experience that people who get called able-bodied would have of walking around and using their bodies freely to move about in space and to do things. For me, the situation that I'm in is perfectly normal. So that gives me a certain slant. Obviously, people who have come to have limited use of their bodies, or cognitively speaking, to have less or different, let's say different, to have different use of their minds and their emotions. They might have come to that situation after having been another way for a while, and that can cause some real loss, a sense of loss. I do get that, but I've never actually had that. So I'm just saying that as part of the context from what I'm speaking. The story that I think is the central story for us, for me today, it happened when I was about 12. My family was Anglican. We lived in a small town in Ontario. There were problems in the Anglican Church at that time, as we now well know, but they weren't public at that point. But it did give the sense sometimes that my family was a bit worried about what was going on in the church. And on top of that, I had been very, very excited and interested in brownies. Brownies was one of the opportunities for young girls at our church. And I had gotten every possible badge that a brownie could get. And you can imagine that it took some creativity on the part of myself and my parents for us to do that. And also, there was one of the brownie leaders, her name was Brown Owl. Can't remember her real name. But she'd taken a bit of a shine to me, and she'd worked out ways that I could get the ball throwing badge and done some other things. So I had felt very much that I could be who I wanted to be in the context of brownies. And however, I really noticed that I was still a brownie when other girls around me had gone to be girl guides. And I was puzzled by that, and certainly asked when was going to be my chance to fly up. And then one day, the big cheese, I can't remember her name either, but she took me to the back of the parish hall and she said, "You don't really want to be a girl guide. We don't have any disabled girls in girl guides, and you're not going to become a girl guide." And I was, it's one of those moments that's very, very difficult to describe. You know, adults would say words like devastated, but I wasn't that old yet to really fully grasp either what I was experiencing or what was happening. So the Sunday arrived. I was sitting in the back of the church, which is the only place I could sit in that church. I was preceded by rows and rows and rows of the back of people's heads, which I could not see over. I was very upset and crying. I was very much alone. And I could hear the pastor saying that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And it was a moment of real dialogue for me, in the sense that I said to God, either you're a complete and utter liar, or you will help me find a way. Because I couldn't imagine that I could have been created with as much passion for life as I have by a God who would then make it impossible for me to live that passion. So many, many years later, looking back on that, I realized that that was a crisis of faith. And for many people in my situation, could I say our situation, many people, of course, doubted and gave up, and we know lots and lots of people who got depressed, committed suicide, allowed themselves to become ill and pass away. That was the moment for me when I chose. I chose what I felt at that moment was the only choice I really had, which was to believe that I would find a way with God's help. So it was a very personal moment, but what I want to say is that that is a very human moment. It's not just me that either does go through that or did go through that particular experience. And in some ways, I think every human being has a moment like that in their own language, in their own culture, in their own way. And it happens to be a bit more focused, maybe, for those of us who've been labeled something, but it actually is a very human moment when you realize that the world is not actually your oyster, shall we say, that you will face huge barriers and boundaries, and that you're still the one that's responsible for how you lead your life, and that responsibility can only be carried out in a faithful dialogue, however that appears to you to be. And then the other thing I wanted to say about this whole topic of disability is that the scriptures that I know are very, very clear about the idea of gifts. And that, in fact, in the Christian Bible, it says that we are given the gifts not for our own benefit, not to say that we wouldn't have benefit from them, but they're not for our own benefit, they're for the benefit of the church. And the church is the body of Christ. So, scripturally speaking, the organism that matters the most is not our individual personal bodies, so much as it is this being through which God lives in the world, through which Jesus in particular lives in the world, which is the church. And I don't mean necessarily the organized church, but that, anyway, the Spirit lives through ourselves together in relationship with each other. And that the various characteristics that I have can be gifts for enlivening that community. Now, the concept of disability, some of the things that I am are a lack. They're a problem. They're something that's supposed to be fixed if possible, hidden sometimes, and at the very least considered to be a problem, something that shouldn't have happened. So I'm sure others have had this experience, but a person who's been labeled, and certainly myself, we tend to go through life with people looking at us, and it's almost like they're not really looking at us. They're looking over our shoulder at somebody they think we should have been. So if somebody's looking at me, they're seeing the person that doesn't use a wheelchair. Somewhere in their mind, they're seeing the person that they think I would have been if I didn't have spinal muscular atrophy. They're not actually seeing me, because for them to see me is somehow not right, it's not bearable to them. And of course, when you live in this world, as we all do, we have the same feelings. So even though I know I'm a person who has limited use of my body, I will still daily experience that this is not the right way to be, and then put that out of my mind. Only because the culture constantly is telling me. And there are many, many other examples, like people are very frustrated right now with how all the advertisements have skinny women in them, and all the women who aren't skinny feel that somehow they should be skinny, and that's creating all kinds of issues for women who aren't so skinny. And in fact, skinny women are not that healthy sometimes. So we got this huge mess going on because the culture is saying there's this kind of body that's right, and that kind of body is not quite right. So it isn't just about the thing we call disability, but it is particularly about us for sure. That kind of way of seeing things is not the idea of giftedness that we see in the scriptures. And in the 80s and up to about the mid-90s, I struggled to try to figure out what would I actually say, and how would I actually think if I didn't think disability. How would I explain things? how would I express myself? And how would I talk about a person who thought differently or had emotions that were more erratic? And honestly, it took me about 8 years to actually have language that allowed me to not use the word disability. So part of my journey during that time was to listen to people who were expressing something really powerful and healing that had happened for them around somebody who had been labeled something. The very first story I ever heard was around a young fellow who was about 14, 15, 16 years old at the time, whose name was Enosh. And he was a fellow who had never spoken and had some different ways of perceiving what was going on in the world. So he really needed to be with another person to guide him through his day. And his family had a little bit of money, I guess, so they actually hired somebody to go to school with Enosh so that he could be in a regular high school. And he loved to be in the art class. Although the kind of art that he produced wasn't quite the same as what the other kids were producing, but he clearly really enjoyed himself when he was there. And the other kids began to really enjoy him as well. And later on, one of the people that had gone to school day by day with Enosh wrote a letter about her experience as his assistant at school. She said that being with Enosh had changed her life, that she'd become a much more compassionate person, that she'd become a much happier person, and she'd become much more aware of the value of differences, and also more aware of the value of differences in art making. And she really, really thanked Enosh for teaching her many things. Now, I've heard so many stories like that. That was the first time I heard that story. But I've heard that many, many times, where people say that they've gone to be with somebody that they think they're going to help. And it's not that they haven't helped that person, but when they weigh up what they've given versus what they've received, they honestly feel that they have been the receivers of some deeply transforming gift from that person. So I began to create a list of the various gifts that people talk about when they talk about being with someone who's been labeled disabled in some way. The first and foremost one, kind of the one that Enosh expressed, you might call gifts of hospitality, where the person is opening a space for deeper listening and also opening a space for people to feel happier. Over all those years that I was exploring this particular approach, I'd say about 85 or 90% of the people that I talked to said that being with someone who had been labeled disabled in some way just simply made them feel happier. Now, I think if a company, if a corporation in North America ever caught on to this idea, here was a really simple way of making people feel happier, there might be a big turnaround in our economy, but so far nobody's gotten on. Anyway, some of the other gifts. Grounding, slowing people down, making them aware of actually where they are, what they're actually doing, and who they're actually doing it with. A lot of people say that when they're with someone who's been labeled something, they're forced to get out of their daily rhythm. It takes longer to eat. It takes longer to get in the car and get out of the car. It takes a little bit more time to get a communication across and understand what the person is saying. And that in that process of simply slowing down, they become much more present to what is going on. Now, we do that sometimes in our society, but we don't call it helping people so much. Like if I create a spa and I make people pay big money to lie down and relax, you know, everybody thinks it's great, right? But if I hire somebody to be with somebody who takes 3 times as long to walk to the store, somehow there's something wrong with that person. And the other person is really nice for helping them out, right? And that's the whole conversation of disability. I'm going to tell you another story to really capture this idea of what I mean by giftedness and what I think the scriptures mean. And this would fall under kind of the grounding idea, but also the hospitality idea, and also the networking idea of giftedness. I have a friend named Miriam, and Miriam asks a lot of questions. So how I met Miriam was that in 1993, a co-op started in the middle of Toronto, and the idea of the co-op was to be inclusive. And in 1 month, I think it was 56 of us moved into the co-op all at the same time. And we had never met each other. Now, in any urban context, if 56 strangers move into a building with 3 floors of apartments, the chances that they would actually meet each other are very small. Like you could literally live there for about 5 or 6 years without meeting all 56 people. You might meet 2 or 3 actually. So within 3 weeks we all knew each other. How did that happen? Well, Miriam loves to walk into people's apartments without knocking. She loves to ask people very awkward questions, like, why is your nose so long? Or, you know, why do you wear that color? And then she goes into the next apartment without knocking and tells everybody what she just found out about the person in the previous apartment and asks them the same questions. So within, days, we were all talking to each other, if only to figure out what to do about Miriam, right? But this is the real story. The building that we moved into was originally developed for condos, but the developer had gone under and the city had bought the building and turned it into social housing. And along the way, to cut costs, they had changed the air circulation system. And we didn't know that. So when I moved into the building, very soon after I got there, I started to feel sick. Now, if it wasn't for Miriam, I would know that I felt sick. But because of Miriam, we knew that we felt sick. And we got onto it very quickly and discovered that what was happening was the air circulation system was picking up the car fumes from the car park that was underneath our building. So we were able to get the city to put in a modification to the air circulation, and only 1 person died. Not perhaps several people before we figured out what was going on. So in other words, Miriam saved a number of lives. Miriam turned us into a community, and Miriam gave us the power to be able to advocate for ourselves. That's a gift according to the scriptural sense of giftedness, because she healed the community. I figured out over the years that there's at least 24 gifts that are very frequently expressed by people who are labeled disabled. Those gifts include things like improving the educational system, because we've discovered it, and I just recently watched a TED Talk where a real professor from New Jersey is talking about how the school system knows that schools that are inclusive of children who have different academic abilities have higher academic achievement across the board, including the kids that are considered to be academically bright. Their achievement goes up in the presence of children who are labeled something. We've known that for a long time, by the way, but somehow the school system doesn't act as if that were true. And perhaps one of my most favorite gifts, I don't know why I say that exactly, but I've spent a good deal of time trying to make this present to people, and that is that people become more peaceful in inclusive environments. Schools that are inclusive have less drug use and violence, and communities that are more inclusive have greater economic prosperity and less crime. So there's something about the presence of people that our society labels as disabled which stimulates appreciation of difference. And when we are able to appreciate difference, we are able to fight less. So back to the theology of this. We live in a world where we're tempted constantly to believe either that the world knows what's right and what's wrong, or God knows what's right and what's wrong. The world that believes the world knows what's right and wrong is very much based in a categorization of people. So there's the race categorization, black, white, brown, all the rest of it. There's the economic categorizations of, poor, not so poor, middle class, upper class, all that sort of thing. But much more than that. I don't think I'm explaining myself very well right now, but the world is divided up into categories, and we create rules based on those categories, and we create privileges based on those categories. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, don't get me wrong. Like, just to take a very simple example, when you use a car, either as a driver or a passenger, you're agreeing that you will stay on the right side of the road. If you're in Canada, in North America, you'll stay on the right side. And as long as you agree to stay on the right side, everybody's safer. And everybody can get around. Now, you have the right to go on either side of the road, theoretically. But if you actually implemented that right, you'd be taken off the road really fast, either by an accident or by the law. And we'd all agree with that because we know that you're making not only yourself unsafe, but everybody else. So that kind of categorization of the world actually works in a certain sense. So, we all have our little places we live in, and we pay our money and we go to work, or we get our welfare check or whatever, and we're all following these little paths of how things are supposed to work in society. In that world, the concept of disability is very powerful. I expect to be able to say that I'm disabled in that world. I expect to be able to say I have certain rights based on the fact that my body doesn't work very well. If certain programs weren't in place for me, I would probably advocate for them. Like I would advocate for funding for personal assistance, and I would advocate for better job support for people who have difficulty academically speaking. But inside that kind of thinking, I'm not ever able to move very far out of my place. And my place does not allow me to express my deep personal giftedness or my deep personal relationship with life itself. In that kind of thinking, what I am is exactly the replication of what the category says I should be. And nothing else is important in that kind of thinking. So I'm in a sense not a created being inside that thinking. I am just another piece of a machine. So here's the tricky part. Both are true at the same time. I do live in a world that's about the law and the categories and the structures. I am also in a created relationship with the creator of the universe. A personal relationship with the creator of the universe. Both are true. So I am, in fact, both disabled and not disabled at the same time. So for me, the question is, from which stance can I live my life most powerfully, both for myself and for the community, or in other words, for the church? From which position am I more able to contribute, more able to experience a fulfilled life, more able to encourage faith in the community, and more able to bring richness as a legacy beyond when I will personally be present in the world? I personally don't think disability is the position from which I can be powerful. I think disability is the position from which I can be controlled. So Jesus said that he was here not to get rid of the law, but to fulfill the law. And that is, in fact, the very journey that we're all on. We are existing inside of the law. We don't particularly want it to go away because then there'd be chaos. But we are not creatures of the law. We are here to fulfill it. And that means stepping outside of what the law would create us to be and bringing our personal relationship with the Creator to the world. I can't do that from being disabled, because to do that from being disabled is to deny the gifts that I uniquely can bring to the church. So the last thing I wanted to say about this was to go back to what I said last year, and that is, if I recognize that I am a perfect reflection of the creator of the universe, then it's perfectly okay for me to believe that God is quadriplegic and that she has no hands and feet, obviously. She has no body. And that in order for her will to be carried out in the world, she needs personal assistance. And that each and every one of us has the opportunity to be one of God's personal assistants. And those of us who get through life by being in relationship with personal assistants, we have a lot to say about what it's like to be a good personal assistant. So how about we reflect on our experience from the positive and the powerful side of it, and bring our deep understanding and bring our powerful gifts to the community so that the Church of God will be strong. Thank you very much.
Judith, welcome. And thank you very much for such a wonderful and inspiring talk.
You're welcome. Sorry, I was on mute.
I know that feeling very well. The questions from the floor. Who would like to begin?
Hi, Judith. It was great listening to you today, and I enjoyed you last year also. My name is Anne. My question, and I guess it's really more a request for clarification in terms of, well, why you feel that you have more ability to influence not from the position of disability. So I guess the way I'm interpreting that is I can understand theologically and within the faith community and infusing inclusiveness within the faith community that will then carry out in people's lives into the world has power. But then also, are you saying that within that world, separate from the faith community, you don't see yourself having an ability to influence people and change them or change perceptions?
I don't think I'm saying that. I love the way I get myself tied into knots. Clearly, as a person who's labeled disabled, I fit very clearly into a world that the world I spoke about as being the world of the law, which is the world that we're very familiar with. I fit, though, as an advocate, pretty much. Because the most important thing about me in that world to other people, the most obvious thing about me to other people is the fact that I'm quadriplegic. So what I'm saying is that obviously that's the way it works, and I'll do that pretty often. But I need to remember, and the faith community needs to remember, that my real relationship in the world is as a created being in personal relationship with God. From that position, I have much more that I can contribute, and many, many more ways that I can experience a fulfilling and powerful life in the community. Does that help?
Good.
Yeah.
I'm here. Oh. She said yes.
Okay.
She said it forcefully.
Okay. Or can you tell me how it helps? Because then maybe we could say a bit more.
Yeah. The questions.
Hi, I'm Amy. I was really intrigued by your story about Miriam and the fact that people with different types of disabilities can help each other. And I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about how that works, or how you think that people with different types of giftedness can help each other in the church or in the world of the law, as you said. I'm just curious if you have more insight on that.
Well, I want to be clear, it wasn't about people with disabilities helping people with disabilities only. It's Miriam and I both moved into a co-op, which is inclusive. In other words, people of all different diversities are represented in that group of people. But to answer your question particularly, uh, when Miriam was doing what she's doing, she doesn't think she's helping. She's just doing what she's doing. Helping, quote unquote, is another idea that comes from the world of the law, where there are helpers and people who are helped. Inside genuine community, everything that we are can be of benefit to somebody else, and everything that they are can be of some benefit to us. And it isn't necessarily predictable. It isn't predictable what about me is going to be useful to you or helpful to you. So, just to be really clear, the kind of gift that I spoke about that Miriam has is a very irritating gift. But I don't imagine that we liked having this thing going on. The fact that she would go in and out of apartments and talk to people, we literally had to figure out what was the way that we could support Miriam to be a little bit less intrusive, and to find her ways that she could participate in the community that brought out the best in her without her being so intrusive. So we could have very easily completely ignored the benefit of Miriam's gift, and in fact turned it down, like lowered the volume on Miriam, if you like. So I'm not talking about a mechanical way of saying, okay, you have this particular issue, therefore we'll plug you into that particular relationship and everything will be happy. It's not like that. It's way more emergent in relationship. And we need to have powerful discernment going on all the time to figure out what's really happening. It was only in hindsight that I would be able to say, you know what, a whole lot of people would have died if Miriam hadn't broken down the barriers for us and got us talking to each other. It was literally 2 or 3 years later that it became obvious to me, and it's still not obvious to many people, that that was the key thing that brought our community together, was Miriam's intrusion. So what I'm saying, I hope, is that the world of giftedness is, you have to look at it from a very different perspective. And quite often, being able to really encourage giftedness in each other is a challenging thing. Like, it was challenging to have Miriam be that intrusive in our community.
She said thank you. My name's Wes. Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed what you had to say about the paradox of both worlds and even that tension. And my question is, how do you live in personally, how do you live in a world that constantly, the world of the law, that does try to categorize, it does try to limit? How do you personally deal with that tension?
Depends on the day, depends on the project. Like, for example, the way I get my funding for personal assistance, it kind of broke down slowly over the last 5 years. So I've had to become an advocate, quote unquote, again, claiming my need for more money for my personal assistance. But at the same time, I have a support circle. We meet and we talk about the impact of that lack of funding and the impact of going for more funding. And we talk about what other ways I might try to solve that problem. And I'm not just going to simply go along with the way that the money's been offered. I'm going to counter offer and say, anyway, I don't want to get into the details. But the point is that I balance it in my own life with conversations with people who know me and care about me and want me to keep on being an effective participant in the community. So I've always got this other mirror in my life that reminds me not to get trapped in that world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm getting very jealous, by the way, watching all of you go for your coffee and donuts. I want one too.
Judith, thank you so much for your just everything you said. I really appreciated it. My name is Bethany, and I especially agreed and resonated with what you talked about with inclusive communities being more peaceful. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if that was just kind of anecdotal, because I mean, I've seen that in my experience, or whether you were drawing from, like you had read a study or there's some research that's been done on that, or whether it was just kind of experiential.
It's mostly anecdotal. Way back in the early 90s, I did a literature review for a professor of education and discovered that there was data that reflected that idea. But the data was always part of, it's like the leftover data. After people looked at what they really wanted to look at, they would make side comments about, oh, by the way, these kids seem to be so much more peaceful. And there's been less violence in the schoolyard since we became inclusive. So I cannot point to a specific study or group of studies that says that inclusion leads to more peace. But I can say that the data is there, and if somebody's got the money and the time to go dig it out, it's definitely available.
Yeah. And you could certainly say that exclusion leads to a lack of peace, if nothing else.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious, right?
Yeah, exactly. One question, Judith. You talked about the idea of opening spaces through presence, which struck me as, well, very powerful, but also, for example, for people with profound intellectual disabilities, the idea of presence opening spaces. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Can I say more? I don't know. I mean, say a bit more yourself about what you're thinking. Maybe I can latch on there somewhere.
Well, the assumption often is that a gift is something that you have and then I have to do something with it. You seem to imply that a gift is simply being.
Well, there are both gifts. There are gifts of doing, for sure. But there are also the gifts that are where things start showing up in your presence. And happiness is one of those huge gifts that kept showing up keep on showing up for me in my interactions with people about giftedness. People are always telling me how, in somebody's presence, a particular person that maybe doesn't speak or has Down syndrome or something like that, people are always telling me how they just somehow seem to feel happier in that person's presence. So it's something to really notice that it isn't just about what people do. It's about what happens because people are there. Sometimes a kind of catalyst gift. Just to give you another example of this is actually written out in data in a number of places. And that is that a teacher who has a classroom where children with different intellectual abilities are present in the classroom. If that class is run on a cooperative basis, the teacher's skills improve as a teacher. And the result of that is that, say, 2 or 3 or 4 years later, you'll find that there are children who otherwise might have been struggling academically are suddenly now doing very well in that classroom because that teacher has gained some skills. All of that happens without the specific child necessarily doing anything particular other than being in the classroom like other kids.
That's great. Thank you.
Judith, I'm Jason. Thank you very, very much for the talk. I really loved it. Thank you very much for that. Now, Judith, my guess is that you would not identify yourself as a theologian. You can tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, that's correct, yes.
But you're coming kind of close, and you're developing a very potentially compelling theology of the church. But another theological issue is the concept of sin, and I wonder what you might think of that, and what kind of experiences you may have had, personal experiences with people connecting disability and sin.
Oh, we don't have an hour, do we? Well, it's a long topic, but let me just say this. To go back to the idea that perhaps God is quadriplegic, because I noticed that people aren't talking about that. And in fact, I didn't talk that much about it. So let me go back to that for a minute. There's a certain kind of understanding of God that suggests that God always knew how it was going to go and always knew what the end of it would be. And that we're just trying to figure out what's going on with the God who won't tell us what's going on, right? I don't think that's actually God. I don't think that's the way it goes. I think that we are actually in relationship with God, and that a part of being in a relationship is, it's very interesting. I signed into Skype here as the woman before me was speaking, and she was giving some examples and some readings about being angry, and a video clip about being angry with God. Or can you imagine that maybe being angry with God is one of the most important things we do? Because we are in dialogue with our Creator. And together we are actually creating the world. So we need to let her know how it's going. This is not working is a really important message for God to get. And of course, it's not that black and white. Don't get me wrong. I understand that. But I think it's very important for us. So to get back to sin, sin comes from the idea that there is a perfect way that things would be. And somehow we're falling short of the standard that God already knows what it is. I don't think that's what the scriptures are aiming at. And they might have been. I mean, I know they were. back in Genesis and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and all that. But I think God has progressed, if you like, in relationship with us and us with God, progressed to another understanding. And when Christ says he came to fulfill the law, that's what he's talking about, I think, in part. Is the whole idea of sin doesn't work as an understanding, right? I'm not quadriplegic because something else went wrong somewhere, or I messed up in some way. I'm quadriplegic because God created a world where diversity is possible, and where diversity is unpredictable. And this is the kind of diversity that can happen sometimes. And it's a struggle, but all gifts are a struggle. The word cross and the word gift are synonymous. So when Christ says pick up your cross, he's actually saying pick up your gift. I mean, that's a longer conversation too, but just look at it like that for a while. I'm kind of rambling a bit, I'm sorry, but would you say what you think I'm saying? And then I can clarify.
No, that's great, Judith. It's more, part of the thing is some people who have been labeled disabled have had experiences of persons explicitly connecting their disability with sin, or
Yes.
someone sinned. And partially I was just curious as if you have experienced some of that also.
Oh, yes. Of course. I mean, today it's more amusing than anything else, but when I was like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it was very common and very difficult. And I don't believe it anymore.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Heather, and I appreciate the dynamic that you've put out there that will build, that we have disabilities yet because we have a relationship with God, we don't. And so I appreciate that. So I'm going to ask a very annoying question because I'm asked this all the time and it annoys me. So I think that it will annoy you. But I'm not sure. Do you think that there will be disabilities and impairments in heaven?
Do I think there will be disabilities and impairments in heaven? I hope so. Otherwise, it's going to be very boring. Somebody back here has got his hand up, or her hand up.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm actually looking from the back of all of your heads, believe it or not, but the actual computer with me in it is behind all of you.
Hi,
So I'm
Judith.
looking at myself.
I'm sorry.
Hi.
I didn't mean to step over you. My name is Shelley Christensen. I work in the Jewish community. And
Yes.
thank you for adding to my now brain, my exploding brain.
Yes.
Because you hit on something in describing the worlds that people live in, and that the idea of the world of the relationship with God and the relationship with the community is what is the understandable piece in all of this, I think, as congregations grow up into this field of inclusion. But as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about, well, what is the purpose of of using the word disability? So many organizations have inclusion committees to bring people with disabilities in, to, we have Jewish Disability Awareness Month. We're constantly calling out the word disability in all of this, and it, as a way of saying, well, there are people out there who want to come in and want to belong. They have disabilities. It's like almost having to identify and label people in order to explain, and in order to get to and evolve to the point where people are just contributing, where people are living that relationship with God and coming into the community and being able to explore what that means and share it and so forth. So it's, I'm just trying to think through the purpose of the label and how to mitigate that to get to the point where we don't need to, as congregations, as people of faith and organizations, we don't have to look at people and say, oh yes, they have a disability and we're, they're here, they're present, we invite them in, we have, it's getting to the real core of what we're talking about. And I hope this is making some sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I'm going to try and tell you a story quickly. And there's a book called Dreaming Community on inclusion.com, which has the story in it. But it's the story of a young man with Down syndrome who is probably not more than 16 or 17 years old, and his companion got onto the idea that the best thing to do was to travel around the city by bus and subway and figure out where Peter was most welcome. And the long and the story of the story, excuse me, was that Peter ended up being in a very close relationship with a group of Anglican monks, or the Order of St. John's of the Holy Cross, I think. And one of the monks was a priest at the local Anglican church, and he invited Peter to become an altar server with him. And the end of the story is that over a very short period of time, a whole lot more people started coming to that church. And I'm telling you that story because something you said, and you may not have intended it this way, but it sounded like we'll invite people in so that they can have a relationship with God. And really, in many, many ways, it's quite the other way around. It's that everybody has a relationship with God. And some people have, because of the very challenging circumstances that they live with. Some of us have had the opportunity to really duke it out with God and come up with some deeper, I'll say for now, it's kind of a weak way to say it, but a deeper understanding of what is the real purpose of our lives, our vocation, and what it is we are actually able to be in order to make life worthwhile for ourselves. And I'm not saying it's an intellectual exercise. It certainly wasn't for Peter, but Peter is always profoundly moved by any opportunity that he had to express his spirituality, and it moved an entire community. So the point about inclusion is not to help a bunch of people who would otherwise be excluded. That's not the point at all. The point is that when we live ourselves separately, we're cutting ourselves off from some of the power of the different kinds of relationships and experiences that people have had, both in society and spiritually speaking. We're cutting ourselves, we're limiting the extent to which we can experience our life and our spirituality. Inclusion brings us a much richer community, a much richer church. And to be inclusive means to open up the dialogue. Not so much about how can I help you, but what is it you're bringing that I didn't see before? What is it you're making available that I had no awareness of? And how can we be in dialogue with each other so that those awarenesses are there for everyone and not just a few people? Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. My name is Linda, and in our place of worship, the definition of inclusion seems to be a segregated Sunday school, of a Halloween fall dance, and a spring prom. And a few parents are saying, gosh, I wish my adult son could go to absolutely anything in our place of worship. And it almost seems like if you start with that, it's harder to move and have that paradigm shift. And I'm wondering if you have any experience or advice that could help our church move to something that's really, truly, fully inclusive. Please.
Well, most of the experience I have with that sort of thing is walking away because it wasn't working and go find somewhere else to be. So that's not very hopeful for you, I guess. But if I were actually on site with you at this moment with that particular young man, the young man who's called disabled, wants to participate fully in the church, then what I would do is I would build a circle of friends that came to him, not inside the church building, but in whatever space is familiar and comfortable for him, and begin there to have the dialogues about where and how people can break through the barriers so that he has more opportunity than he has now. So that it wasn't a policy that you were trying to shift, but that you're shifting the actual opportunities that are available. And as those opportunities shift, then the next step is to pick up on the people who appreciate what's happening. So let's say, just to pick an example, let's say he gets to join the men's prayer group. There'll be 2 or 3 men in that prayer group who pick up on how much better it is now that that young man is there. So inviting them into the circle of people that meet with him and figure out how to break through the barriers in the church.
Thank you very much, Judith. Judith, we're coming to the end of our time, but before we
Yes.
close our meeting, can you do 2 things, please? Could you bring us up to date with the things that you're involved with just now, and also tell us where we can buy your books?
Well, the second one's easiest. Inclusion.com, www.inclusion.com has my books.
Great.
What am I up to? It's always a difficult question. The most exciting thing, I think, is that I've been offered the opportunity to mentor a man who runs a community development organization in the UK. And he follows the ABCD model, which is the asset-based community development model. So one of the big words that he uses is mischief. He thinks of really good community development as being a kind of mischief where you're speaking power to the edge of the world and supporting change in the world. And he wants me to mentor him, which I think is really cool. So that's coming up for me. I don't know if people know this, but primarily I identify myself as an artist. I paint through with the support of art facilitation, and it's really important for me at this point to continue developing my art style.
That's great.
That's me in a nutshell.
Well, that's in a nutshell. That's very good. Well, it sounds like you're up to some fascinating things, and we look forward to seeing what comes out in the future. But for now, we're very, very grateful to you for your insight, for your presence, and for changing the way we see the world just a little bit. So thank you very much, Judith.
Well, you're more than welcome. Thank you.